Kia ora mai tātou. Ka tīmata anō mo te wiki e toru. Nō rei he mihi kawana kia koutou. I tīnei wā e tukanata rākau ki te tangata i te rangatira shared i tīmata i tātou I runga ngā kuku te atua. Anō reira Ngāti Pārau, nau mai haru mai. I tukanata rākau. So we'd just like to ask Shared to start off our proceedings for week 3.
Ai o I rungi I rangi nui e tū a ke nei whakarunga mai ti te rui humai rā. E o I rungi tu wai tai wai Māori wai moana e pari nei whakapiri mai, whakatotu mai, whakarunga mai rā. E o I rungi a papatū anuku e tako tōnei nau mahare mai. A tēnei a tāne ka huakina, ka whakatākina tu waire ki runga ki tēnei whenua waire, waire. Ka tākina te kaua, ka te kaua nui, ka te kaua roa, ka te kaua whakatiki-tiki a humana, tiki-tiki o te rangi. Kia tipu aki ko te pū, ko te wē, ko te rito, ko te pūkinga, ko te wānanga, ko te more, ko te taura, ko te tauera. Tēnā te awhinuku, te awhirangi no te pū, ororo I a matua kore. I pū I aki te takutaku e nuku e rangi. Kia hua ua mai te rungo ki runga ki te tipua, ki runga ki te tāwhito, ki rungi ki te kāhui o ngā ariki, kia puta tēnei kaupapa ki te whaia ki te ao mārama. Tūturu o whiti whakabaua kia teina.
Teina.
Haumi e hui e.
Ai.
A ka huki nei au ki te oroko hango a huiri. Hei pupu ki te raki, te tohu o te manu o te mauri o whatu māmua. A I he taunga waiho e te rotu waiho kia whatu māmua. Anō na taku kiripango. A nā wairā ki te whanga nui a orotu, ko te ipua te raia, ko te mara tāwhao, ko ana tini ki runga, ko ana tini ki raro. A kati ana maunga hāreru tūwhera tangitu, kati ana tangitu tūwhera maunga hāreru. A te tiro whakarunga hau ki tōku maunga me te pātū wata ko hipurangi me o tātara. Ka heke whakararo ki ngā wai kaukau a kuima a koroma. Te wai o mahurangi ki tāua tūtai kuri te waka tapu o tā ki te mutu waka. Ka tai te aua ki te moana nui a kiwa, te aua whakairo whenua tainoa ki te mutu aua ko more te kaiti a ki I raro I a matarua hau e kaukau ana, a kaitoa ko pānea te tipua no te iwi punaturi. Ka huki nei au ki ngā kiuti ki ngā marae maha o te whanga. Kei reira ko tōku hapu ko Ngāti Pārau, a mātaki-taki ana au I te rahi o tōki iwi o Ngāti Kahungunu, a ko tāri hā te moana nui te tangata a tihei mauri ora. A huri no I tō tātou nei whare a tāhua tēnā tātou, a kei aku rangatiro mangaroa marae tēnā koutou, a kai whakawā tēnā koutou, te kaunihiro o te rohe nei tēnā koutou katoa, huri noa, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou I te rā, a tēnā rā tātou katoa. Kia ora e te whānau. Kia ora.
A ka tira tiru ana te rākau ki runga, ka whiua ki raro ki papa tu anuku, ka putatari tangata ki te whai ao ki te ao marama. Au e kiaik, e ke panuku, e ke tangaro, whānau haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tai. A ka tira, e te tamaiti, tēnā koe. Tēnā koe e mihi nei ki a tātou I tēnei ata, e hui nei anō I raro I te karanga. Ke tirohia ngā wai o ngā awa o tēnei rohe. Arā, kei te maringi mai te wai, mai a ranginui. Au ākera, he kaupapa whakahira-hira tēnei. Whakahira-hira mō tātou katoa, mō ngā iwi katoa o te motu. Nā reire hui nei raro I tēnei te taupokitanga o tēnei whare a tāhua, te tūro hare hau e, koe nei ngā whakaero o oe nei rā, e iri nei i roto i tēnei whare. Nā reira, e te mihi atu ki a koe, nā ui whakatako tō te Arafat ki aia, ki te wāhi ngaro. O tira ngā mate huhu o te motu, e hinga nei tukuna atu rātau, mihia, tangihia, kia hui no rātau, ki kone i tēnei rā, tātou katoa piritahi nei. Nā reira, kānui rā ine mihi ki a tātou, engari kānui te tangi atu ki a koe, nara ki a tātou katoa. Ko tau mai anō ki tēnei hui, i tēnei wiki, huri noa, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora rau, he mihi kawana no kia koutou ko tai mai nei raro te tūne e tēnei whare. Good morning, welcome everybody to week 3 of the hearings. I'd like to say this is our last week, but it's certainly not. Week 3, welcome again. I thought we'd recap because there are some people who have not been at our hearings previously. So apologies to those who've heard my introduction speech. Just to reaffirm again that we're considering proposed Plan Change 9 to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council Regional Resource Management Plan, in particular land and water resources in the Tūtaikuri, Ahuriri, Ngaruroro and Karamu catchments, often referred to as TANK. We've been delegated the role to make the decision, so a little bit different to some other plan changes where we will make a recommendation to the council. The council will consider it and then make its decision and adopt it. We've been given the decision-making powers. I'd like to introduce our panel, and I'll get them to introduce themselves. Ryder, would you like to start?
Well, my name is Ed. Hello, Kirikiri. I'm domiciled in Wellington. I'm halfway to retirement, whatever that means.
A tēnā koutou, Roger Maka. I'm from Takapau and part of Kahungunu, Whanui Tonu. And yeah, I'm like Ro, but a little bit behind him.
Just to note that they're not retired this week or in the coming months. My name's Antoine Coffin. I'm from Tauranga. I'm a Hearing Commissioner and Freshwater Commissioner. Been involved with Māori resource management for about 25 years, so I'd like to consider myself an anthropologist who's fallen into planning, if there's such a thing. That's all.
My name's Howie. I've been working in resource management for about 40 years. My background's essentially in water resource management and stream ecology. Most of my work at the moment seems to be in the North Island, even though I'm domiciled in Christchurch. And I'm 98% on the way to retirement.
Good morning, my name's Ryder. I'm a water quality scientist and freshwater ecologist based down in Dunedin. I've been working as an independent in that sort of line of work for 25, 30 years and have been a independent commissioner for probably 20 years or so and sat on about 30 or 40 hearings.
So just in terms of the general sequence of the hearing, in week 1, for those who weren't there with us, we heard from the council briefly at the start of that week. We've been hearing from submitters who wish to be heard and their experts and witnesses. And we're looking forward to the end of this week to hear back from Hawke's Bay Regional Council with their responses to the submissions, evidence and any changes they may have made. We'll be looking to adjourn the hearing for a little while. During the process, the council has made changes to Appendix 11 of the Section 42A report, and we've asked, as a result of those changes, if people would, submitters, whether they've attended or not, if they'd like to make further submissions on the changes to that appendix. They're welcome to do so by the date that I included in the minute. So I see people writing that down, so you might not have been aware of it, hence I'm saying that. So My understanding is that the Appendix 11 was a summary of the hydrological science, and the changes, which are substantial, are mostly deletions from that report. So my understanding is there's no subsequent changes to the Section 42A report or the underlying science in which has been summarised. So that's just a short context, but the rest of the details are in that minute. And so we may hear further submissions on that Appendix 11 at a date yet to be organised. And we have site visits scheduled for this Friday, and the long-term forecast is for good weather. I'm yet to find a forecast that was actually real and true, so we'll wait and see what Friday brings us. We will be recording the hearings, and we've been making those available for people who weren't able to attend the hearings. Just in terms of the microphones, and I know we still do this, we push the button. We actually don't need to push the button. But if you're wanting to have a private conversation when you're at the table, you're best to put the microphone up. Otherwise, it's all going to be recorded. We just asked submitters if they could provide copies of evidence to Nicola and Gavin, who are at the back there. Maggie's away at the moment, and she might join us later in the week. In terms of health and safety, Nicola, was there anything you need to tell us in terms of where we need to get to? I think in case of an emergency, we can go straight out this door to my left and also at the door there, and we will meet outside out in the grass area to our right, so we have to go out the building. Okay. In terms of break times, we've got a morning tea at 10:30, lunch at 1, and afternoon teas at 3:20. I think that's all we've got in terms of those sort of things. Now, we're just going to see if there's any procedural matters or any questions anyone has. Cool, that's great. In terms of our schedule today, and thanks again to Shad for coming in and starting us off a little bit earlier, because we knew the submissions start at 9, so thank you very much for coming in earlier and setting us up in the right way. We've got Horton Z this morning going through to about 10:30, 10:40, that's right. We've got Hawke's Bay Veggie Growers at 11, Ordering's Nursery, then we've got a little break, and at 12:20 we've got Irrigation Services, and then Whitewater New Zealand. We've got a lunch break, and then we've got Roger Brownlee after lunch, John Parsons, Brian McLay. We have Forest and Bird this afternoon about 3 o'clock and a break, and then we have the oil companies after the break in the afternoon. That's our last submitter today. And then tomorrow, and I see we've got some of our kahungunu submitters. They're going to be first tomorrow morning. And we've got quite a full day of submissions tomorrow, right through until the end of play. And then Wednesday, just so you're aware, we've only really got 2 submitters on Wednesday. That's Hastings District Council and Napier City Council, which are doing a tag team for the morning session. Then we have lunch, and then we'll be hearing from Hawke's Bay Regional Council. And then we'll be adjourning the hearing. So just the Monday to Wednesday and Friday site visits this week. Any questions? That's great. Welcome, Hawke New Zealand.
Focused on tight submissions, steering submissions to the point, and this is absolutely what we aim for. I have a few experts here who are going to help support my case, and we have a PowerPoint, which you can see over here, that will talk you through our summation of what we are arguing for. And our first up today, you can hear from Michelle, after my legal submission, you'll hear from Michelle Sands, then you'll hear from Damien Farrelly, who will discuss the NZ gap. Hear from Catherine Sturgeon on water quality, Gillian Holmes on water quantity, Stuart Ford on economics and overseer, followed up Frankie Adams and Andrew on planning. I have copies of the legal submissions, although these are pre-circulated.
I think we've got a copy. Was there? Yeah, we've got the
Same one?
Yes, the one that I sent through on Friday. Oh,
Yep.
Thank you very much. I have copies of those, should you like it, but the
10
ones
pages plus the appendix.
plus the appendix, yes. So the appendix is a key point in that. And the appendix, as you'll see, is our attempt to highlight where we are after the addendum report.
Great,
And-
you've anticipated one of our first questions, how you've got after the addendum report in terms of a
That is exactly where we
synthesis.
landed.
though.
So
Thank you.
hopefully that
That's
directs
helpful.
the commissioners to our thinking, and it's divided up by experts, so you'll be able to see exactly where, for example, Michelle Sands has landed on the recommendations. And this is supplemented by Mr. Dooney's evidence. The appendix to this is a table summarising what was sought by Hort NZ in the submission, and then where the Section 42A report landed on that. So hopefully, with these two appendix tables, you can track your way through exactly what we're looking for and exactly what's outstanding. And myself and all the experts will be happy to take questions on this as well.
Thank you.
I turn to the legal submissions.
Now, we got this on Friday. I'm not sure what people's lives are like over the weekend. I had a list of chores of things because I was away last week as well. So I didn't do much reading. I've had a read of it, but I don't know if all the panel members have had a read through every line. So we're happy for you to take your time and take us through those. And I know we certainly may have some questions around scope and tier 2 hierarchy issues.
Excellent. Well, I'm very
Yeah.
happy to talk about that.
Okay.
But that was the direction I was looking for. So if the commissioners are happy, I will talk you through.
Thank you.
Let me know where I can take stuff as read, and I probably won't read you through all the quotes that I have in there. So, at paragraph 1, Horticulture New Zealand generally supports Plan Change 9. Considers it a sophisticated approach using staging and data gathering to work towards an evidence-based implementation of the concept of Te Mana o Te Wai as set out in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management 2020, which I will refer to as the NPSFM 2020, and I'll try not to slur all those together. Port NZ considers PC9 to be a step-through plan change, which should be seen to give effect to the NPSFM 2020 as far as possible within the scope and consultation requirements, and that's quite important. Hort NZ is generally supportive of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council's approach to the implementation of NPSFM 2020, and as you've heard from them previously in the sort of previous weeks. Hort NZ considers that PC9, as currently drafted in the Section 42A report, recommendations and the addendum report, does not make adequate provision for, nor give appropriate recognition to, the realities of water requirements for food supply needed to support a growing population. And as I've discussed, we call evidence from our 6 witnesses, not in that order, but in the order that I outlined previously. And as they speak to their piece, there'll be bullet points that they'll talk to, and my plan is to give them a chance to run through a brief summary of their evidence and then make themselves available to questions, because I feel like that's probably where the real benefit is going to come from here.
Thank you.
In the Section 42A addendum report, as I noted, the experts have considered this. In Appendix A to the legal submissions is a table summarising their responses to the changes proposed. I deal with an issue of scope arising first, and I note that the submission made by Hort New Zealand states Hort NZ has specific comments about the provisions detailed and sets out those specific comments in the submission. And they sought the specific amendments sought out in the table in the submission or amendments to like effect. Now, in his evidence, Mr. Dooney seeks amendments to objectives 10 through 14 and 16 to support the importance of recognising and enabling the maintenance of food security. And I note that this wording was not explicitly signalled in the original submission. Now, while no scope issue has been raised, I just wanted to front foot this and reassure the commissioners preemptively that these amendments are within scope and fulfil the relevant legal tests, as the amendments are reasonably and fairly within the scope of submissions made by Hort NZ, because Hort NZ were generally seeking recognition of the importance of maintenance of growing capacity and food security. I also submit that no additional persons above those who had already submitted would have been spurred to lodge a submission had the specific amendments to the objectives been included in the submission. And finally, I also submit that no prejudice will arise from inclusion of the wording now sought in Mr. Dooney's evidence. In short, Commissioners, while a reasonable and informed member of the public might not have anticipated the exact words now being sought by Hort NZ, it is my submission that it is reasonable to conclude that such persons could have anticipated that Hort NZ was seeking thematically similar changes to the objectives of PC9. And I do note that I've cited a number of cases there. I can make these available, but I have not printed them because there is hundreds of pages involved, and I suspect that nobody needs to be weighed down further.
Just on that point, I suppose that the difficulty for the panel is the way the submission is has been prepared, and it's quite specific, and it goes through objective tank 8, objective tank 15. It's quite specific to the actual objectives and policies, and so to say that it would be intended to be within scope is hard for us, having read on the face of it which is quite specific in those particular objectives policies, and those ones you identify are clearly not there.
The Commissioner is right, and I suppose my answer would be that while the submission does go into the specifics, it does start off with quite a wide thematic approach, and that wide thematic approach focused on recognising the importance of food, and throughout that is the case. And while we acknowledge that these wording changes were not sought in the submission, it is my submission that thematically they could have been anticipated, and while they weren't there in wording, it is my opinion that it passes the legal tests, because in essence, I don't think the inclusion of this wording would have led anybody who's not involved in the plan change, and there's no prejudice arising from the inclusion of this wording.
I think there's also a difficulty that the words maintenance of food supply don't appear anywhere in the submission, in the original submission. Nowhere in it.
Yes, and I am aware that it is a slight change from the specific wording that was sought. And I guess this is why we tried to front foot the scope issue, even though it hadn't been arisen, to sort of give the commissioners a bit more certainty and confidence.
We'll carry on, but I think we're going to come back to this point again. Sure.
Absolutely, thank you. I turn to paragraph 12, where I discuss the National Policy Statement 2020, and the timing requirements for implementation have already been canvassed in legal submissions from Council for Hawke's Bay Regional Council. And our views on how far the panel can recognise the NPSFM 2020 reflect those of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. And I quote, "Where scope exists in PPC 9 and in submissions to change that would help PPC 9 to give effect to the NPSFM 2020, those changes can be made." And I think that summarises it very succinctly. Note that the Section 42A report recognises that every local authority must give effect to the NPSFM 2020 as soon as reasonably practical. And it does note that there is a limiting factor on this, in that the Section 42A report can only make recommendations which give effect to the NPSFM 2020 where there is scope to do so in the submissions. The Section 42A report also notes, as the Commissioners will be aware, that there has not been engagement to determine how Te Mana o Te Wai applies to water bodies and freshwater ecosystems in the region, and that therefore the report concludes it is not possible to fully give effect to the true intent of the National Policy Statement until this engagement has occurred. Now, nevertheless, Hort NZ considers the direction of PC9 is towards compliance with the NPSFM 2020, and accordingly we have treated PC9 not as an interim plan change, waiting on required changes to bring it into line with the NPSFM 2020, but rather as a step-through plan change to recognising the NPSFM 2020, pending specific consultation. I'm aware that the difference between interim plan change or step-through plan change may be lawyerly semantics, but I do think it's important that this will not be entirely overwritten, in our opinion, to give effect to the NPSFM, that it is a step towards full recognition. Now, the expert evidence from Hort NZ supports this position and makes suggestions as to how to better bring PC9 into line with the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management in a manner which is within scope, and we've been aware of that throughout. I turn now to our topic of tiers 1, 2 and 3 in the hierarchy at paragraph 18. The concept of Te Mana o Te Wai was included in the 2017 National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, but has been further developed in the 2020 version. And the obligation of hierarchies, the hierarchy of obligations, is set out there, which I have no doubt that you're very, very familiar with. The NPSFM 2020 states objectives and policies for matters of national significance that are relevant to achieving the purpose of the RMA. It is Hort NZ's view and my submission that the hierarchy of Te Mana o Te Wai in Tier 2 includes fruit and vegetables for domestic consumption to enable the health needs of people, and in Tier 3, fruit and vegetables for export purposes. In her evidence, Ms Sands, alongside me here, will discuss, and she details in that submitted evidence, the interplay between Te Mana o Te Wai and domestic food supply, and the importance of affordable fruit and vegetables for domestic consumption. It is my submission that the phrase "such as" in Tier 2 of the framework of Te Mana o Te Wai does not limit the health needs of people to only considerations of drinking water. And in a classic Llewellyn move, I turn to the dictionary definition of the phrase "such as," which is defined as used to introduce an example or series of examples. It's my submission that Tier 2 is not limited to just drinking water, and recognition needs to be provided that other aspects that go towards promoting the health needs of people, including fresh fruit and vegetables, such as the types grown in the Hawke's Bay region, fit within Tier 2 of that hierarchy. And it's my submission that the situation of horticulture under Tier 3 is clear. The Section 42A addendum report comments, with regards to the hierarchy, Tier 1 is prioritised first, so we must prioritise the health and well-being of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems. Now, we agree with this comment and note that it is our submission that the way and rate at which over-allocation is phased out should be guided by Tiers 2 and 3, which in turn are guided by Part 2 of the RMA, and I'll just discuss that briefly now. Although recent cases have highlighted the lack of need for recourse to Part 2, except where there is invalidity, and I'd like to note incomplete coverage and uncertainty of meaning, which are sitting in the King Salmon decision, Part 2 is still the engine room of the RMA. In this case, I submit that recourse to Part 2 is helpful and is indeed necessary to understand how the hierarchy of obligations in Te Mana o Te Wai are to be met. Accordingly, I submit that we can look to Part 2, which provides that sustainable management is managing the use, development, and protection of resources in a way or at a rate which enables peoples and communities to provide the social, economic, and cultural well-being, and that full quote is in Section 5 of the RMA. The direction in Part 2 of "in a way or at a rate" does not allow one consideration to trump others. Rather, it is my submission that it requires that the use, development, and protection of resources, in this situation before us, freshwater, is undertaken in a way and at a rate which allows for the matters covered by Tiers 2 and 3. We consider that the requirement to manage resource use in a way or at a rate that enables contains aspects of both time and space. And I submit that the way part of this is vital. The management of the water bodies covered by PC9 must be undertaken in a way which considers how fresh water values are provided for across the full flow regime and at the subcatchment and catchment scale. In addition, the management of fresh water must also consider other values that the tank water bodies support, both within their catchments and beyond, including national values such as food security. I also submit that the rate part of this equation must be undertaken in a way which considers the time required for people and communities to adapt to changing environments. In short, it is my submission that achieving the hierarchy of obligations set out in Te Mana o Te Wai will take time. HortNZ, like the Council, Hawke's Bay Regional Council that is, totally agree that PC9 is a step towards fully achieving the NPSFM 2020 and that future and further work is necessary. In the Section 42A addendum report, the authors note uncertainty with regard to recognition of food supply importance, with the author noting that uncertainty as to how to determine how much water to allocate to fruit and vegetables for domestic supply, and whether all horticulture fits within Tier 2 or within Tier 3. And our response to that is, in our evidence submitted, that horticultural crops grown in the tank catchments are significant for supporting domestic food security. HortNZ seeks that PC9 include recognition of the importance of horticulture in supporting food security in New Zealand and provides the appropriate framework necessary for maintaining the viability and success of horticultural crops in supporting the health of a growing population. I just deviate slightly. I spent the weekend here in the region, driving around, eating vegetables, drinking wine, that sort of thing. And I note that the Hastings...
No, you said you drank wine.
Absolutely.
Sorry, are you including that in
No.
domestics?
No.
Supply?
That's
Okay.
that's just my weekend plans.
Okay.
But I note, while I was driving around, that the Hawke's Bay District Council motto is Urbis et Ruris Concordia, which means town and country in harmony. I just want to point out that this sort of feeds into HortNZ's submission of this urban growth, there needs to be rural support.
Just at 32, and this is something we'll come back to, perhaps with yourself or Ms Sands, just in regards to the other part of the addendum report quote that you've given is about whether domestic supply includes other regions in New Zealand or just the Hawke's Bay. That's important.
Thank you. I feel like this is probably a question for Ms Sands.
Yep.
So I'll be happy to hand that over to her when it's her turn up.
Thank you.
Thank you. I turn now to paragraph 34. The changes sought by Hort NZ are consistent with Te Mana o Te Wai and the associated obligation hierarchy. The changes reflect the importance of some aspects of horticultural activity that are within Tier 2 and others covered by Tier 3. The changes sought are within the scope of PC9, the submissions made on it, and the NPSFM 2020. It is my submission that the changes sought by Hort NZ do not go towards implementing the NPSFM 2020 any further than is appropriate in this case. In the next part of my legal submissions, I will...
Just on that, and you can come back, there's just a question while I've got it in my mind. One of the things you haven't identified in your legal submissions was reference to Appendix 5 of the National Policy Statement, just in regards to those horticultural lands at Pukekohe and I think around Horowhenua. So it seemed to me, I was wondering why you hadn't.
I thought about including this,
Yes.
but on a reread, the references to these areas are very geographically focused.
That's right.
And
In that they don't include the Hawke's Bay.
in that they don't include the Hawke's Bay. I didn't want to cloud the focus here on the Hawke's Bay, but I do take this opportunity to note that the recognition of those two areas is significant,
Yes.
and it is important, and it is a step towards recognising the importance of food security and maintaining New Zealand's ability to provide for national food security. And I think that recognition in the NPSFM of these two areas is an important consideration. While it doesn't include the Hawke's Bay, nevertheless, I do submit that specific recognition should maybe form that sort of lie in the back of the Commissioner's mind.
If my memory serves me right, that they were informed by submissions from a number of parties, including Horticulture New Zealand, in regards to those specific areas, but there were a few other areas, but I don't remember the Hawke's Bay being clearly identified in the list.
I suspect that this may be a question for Ms Sands as well, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I have no doubt that she will absolutely...
Sorry to disturb your flow.
No, I appreciate the questions as I go through, because then my mind's there as well. So as said, I turn to paragraph 35. Policy 11 of the NPSFM 2020 stipulates that fresh water is allocated and used efficiently, all existing over-allocation is phased out, and future over-allocation is avoided. Other policies in the NPSFM 2020 note that management involves integration, climate change considerations, and efficiency. While some of the changes sought by Hort NZ seek to allow water transfer and use, it is my submission that these changes sought fall within the policies of the NPSFM 2020 and do not cut across the requirements of Policy 11. I turn to paragraph 36. Mr Dooney, in his Appendix 1, recommends a series of changes, and I note changes to Rule 5, Schedule 29, and Policy 21 to enable the consenting of land use change within a catchment collective, amendments to more accurately manage nitrogen loss resulting from a change in land use, and changes to Policy 21 to ensure it does not prohibit some commercial vegetable production rotations in tank catchments, and specifically wording changes to mitigate the existing use of the word avoid. And as you'll be aware, there's case law on the use of the word avoid and its directive nature, which we are keen to provide clarity around. At paragraph 37, for the reasons already stated, I submit that these changes are consistent with the NPSFM 2020. The hierarchy of obligations does not require complete compliance with the first obligation at the expense of the second and third. All three matters have to be considered together, so all obligations are provided for. And I submit that Hort NZ's changes achieve this. At paragraph 38, I discuss the water quantity management framework. Hort NZ considers the prevention of reallocation of actual and reasonable allocation within the allocation limit to be undesirable, and seeks a framework that is flexible enough to respond to individual circumstances that require consents. In pursuit of this outcome, Mr Dooney first of all seeks to make Rule 12 a non-complying activity and not the activity that it currently sits at, looks to build flexibility into Policy 37 by allowing water that might become available within the interim groundwater allocation limit or the limit of any connected water body to be reallocated to essential municipal uses or primary production purposes on versatile land or for use in stream flow maintenance and enhancement schemes. And finally, he suggests changes to Policy 38 to enable the reallocation of groundwater without restricting such allocation to holders of permits before the 2nd of May 2020 to recognise the reality of retirement and succession planning of growers. At paragraph 40, Hort NZ also seeks that the definition of actual and reasonable be amended to enable existing water takes, when being renewed, to meet the restricted discretionary conditions of Rules 9 and 10, or fail to be assessed as discretionary under Rule 11. Now, I understand that the Commissioners have had questions for other submitters on this, and I understand that our experts are happy to answer questions and provide greater clarity on what Hort NZ is seeking in regards to the actual and reasonable definition change, and they'll be able to talk to that very clearly.
Thank you.
I turn to 41, where I discuss the legal commentary on prohibited status briefly. Section 87A of the Resource Management Act states that if an activity has a prohibited status, no application for a resource consent may be made, and the consent authority must not grant a consent for it. I note the Environment Court has emphasised the severe nature of the prohibited status, noting the imposition of prohibited activity status on any activity or activities is the most draconian form of control available under the Resource Management Act. And note that a prohibited status should not be imposed lightly and without detailed consideration. Mr. Dooney says the prohibited status in Rule 12 is inappropriate and should be more properly a non-complying status in order to allow flexibility to unusual instances of administratively challenging consent applications. He considers that policies 36 through 38 are sufficient to protect inappropriate water resource allocation. And in conclusion, on my water quantity points, the changes sought by Hort NZ to the Water Quantity Management Framework aim to enable reasonable use of water for horticultural purposes. These uses go to the integrated management of fresh water and the consideration of land use and climate change response. The changes aim at efficient allocation and water use. While Policy 11 of the NPSFM 2020 requires that all existing over-allocation be phased out and future over-allocation avoided, I submit the changes sought do not run contrary to this. In fact, I submit the changes sought are necessary to fulfil the health needs of people and the ability of people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being. These changes sought will implement the NPSFM 2020 in a way and at a rate which enables people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being and for their health and safety, while sustaining the potential of natural and physical resources to meet the reasonably foreseeable needs of future generations, safeguarding the life-supporting capacity of air, water, soil and ecosystems, and avoiding, remedying or mitigating adverse effects on the environment. In conclusion, I submit that PC9 must provide for the continuation of horticulture in the Hawke's Bay area to support local and national growth and food requirements. Permitting appropriate transfers of water permits is necessary to achieve this. Recognition of the importance of horticulture for food security is within the scope and contemplation not only of Hort NZ's submission, but also of the NPSFM 2020. The NPSFM 2020 requires a staged approach to the hierarchy, and precedence cannot be given to the first obligation at the cost of the second two obligations going unfulfilled. The NPSFM must be engaged with in terms of in a way or at a rate, and changes must be made which accord with this requirement, that is, undertaken in contemplation of evidence-based assessments and the needs of the three tiers of the hierarchy. That concludes my submissions. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see if there's any burning questions, otherwise we might hear from your first expert evidence. Yeah, we'll carry on. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Ms. Michelle Sands to address you.
Kia ora, my name's Michelle Sands. I'm the Environment Policy Manager for Horticulture New Zealand, and I will just, as Ms. Buxeda has...
Sorry, Ms. Sands. we're just going to
Oh,
bring
find my
up your
evidence.
bit of evidence.
Yes, okay.
Because I know everyone's shuffling paper up here, and so we're just going to get everyone just to get to your...
That's just summary statement. Would you like to see evidence? Sorry, I'll just find a copy. And we have copies of the summary statements of the evidence for the commissioners. However, the summary statements generally reflect the summary statements at the beginning of the evidence.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Yes, happy for you to continue.
As Ms Buxeter outlined, Hort NZ generally supports the direction of Plan Change 9, but we have a few areas where we're seeking refinements. And I outline our case and my evidence, and I thought that I would just highlight some of the key matters that our team will cover in evidence. Firstly, we support transfers and the recognition of the value of the Hiratonga Plains, that highly productive land. The issue of water transfers will be discussed by my colleagues, Ms Holmes and Mr Ford. We support rootstock survival water provided as a permitted activity, and I just wanted to touch upon this briefly. You know, there are many tree crops on the plains, and in times of drought, when the river flows are low, to keep those trees alive or to avoid them suffering damage, ongoing damage, a small amount of water is required. And that at the moment is provided as a permitted activity and has been made more clear within the Section 42A reply, and we support that. One thing that I wanted to draw to your attention is the water conservation order appeal. We've been in the hearing for that last week. If the appellant's proposal to apply the water conservation order to the lower river was accepted, it has a requirement for consented takes to stop below the minimum flow of 2,400 on the Ngāruroro, and it makes exceptions for those matters recognised in the RMA, so stock drinking water, domestic supply and firefighting, but no exception for rootstock survival water. Now, as it stands, that's okay, because rootstock survival water, or at least for existing activities, is provided for within the permitted activity. I just highlight this because in many plans, rootstock survival water has been provided for throughout New Zealand, but often that's been provided for as a consented activity, and it's been kind of a negotiated outcome through mediation, so most recently in the Northland Plan. And so whilst Hort NZ has accepted a consented status for rootstock survival water and other plans, because of the uncertainty of the water conservation order, it remains very important for us to have that provided for within the permitted activity in this plan. Just moving on, water harvesting and augmentation. This is really important to support existing and new irrigation, and Ms Holmes and Mr Ford will speak to that. Another matter is regarding source water protection, and this is addressed in my evidence, and I wanted to highlight this matter to you. So in my evidence, I raised an issue about source water protection. This is new source water supplies. Under the Water Services Bill, there are very many supplies that would be classified in this way, and including some for horticultural production. So, for example, if a grower had a bore that they then used also to supply workers' accommodation or pack houses, it would be captured by this, the provisions under the Water Services Bill. And what that sets up as a situation where then the risks to that supply have to be mitigated. Now, the point that we are raising here is that the Water Services Bill doesn't include the first part, which would be to avoid new drinking water sources in areas where they are potentially vulnerable. And we think that that's really important that this plan does that, so we don't see a proliferation of new drinking water sources on the highly productive land of the plains, which could then be vulnerable. And so we are seeking that the plan recognise that. Moving on to water quality, and these are matters that will be covered by my colleague Ms Sturgeon and also Mr Ford. We do support collective and individual freshwater farm plans. My colleague Dr Farrelly will speak to the GAP plans, and we do urge a plan framework that aligns farm planning with the GAP schemes. So here, here in these catchments, there's a lot of horticulture. 90% of growers, probably more, in these catchments already have GAP farm plans under the GAP schemes. 80% of growers are captured in the priority catchments that are identified in this plan. And so these are the people that will be progressing with their farm plans first. And we have a scheme which could support them to do that quickly and to do that well. And what we seek is provisions that enable us to support growers to develop those farm plans. I just wanted to touch on climate change. So we sought in my evidence that both emissions and adaptation to climate change be recognised in this plan, and that has been accepted in the Section 42A addendum. And we support that. I think that, in New Zealand, 50% of our emissions are related to agriculture. Throughout the world, our food systems are a leading cause of climate change, and over the next 10 years and in the lifetime of this plan, we need to start to adapt our food systems in New Zealand and throughout the world so they are providing for operating within environmental limits, both freshwater limits, but actually also the limits of our climate, and providing for people's nutritional needs, which takes me to my next point, which Ms Buxeda has discussed, but that's about food security within Te Mana o Te Wai. So, not all horticulture grown on the Hiratonga Plains is for domestic food supply. 70% of New Zealand apples are grown here, and they are predominantly grown for export. But there are more than 100 crops grown in these catchments. It is one of the most diverse growing catchments in New Zealand, and many of the crops have an important role in supporting New Zealand's food security for both fruit and vegetables. And so, for example, summer fruit, which is grown here, 30% of New Zealand's summer fruit is grown here, and that is grown, with the exception of cherries, for domestic food supply. Also, peas and corn, they are grown, a large proportion are grown here, and a significant proportion of those are consumed domestically. So those are the points that I wanted to highlight to you, but I'm happy to take questions as well.
Thank you, Ms. Sands. Dr. Ryder, you want to say something?
It's probably not a question for you, but maybe for more of a planning question or a legal question around Te Mana o Te Wai and the elevation into the second tier for vegetable and fruit production. And I guess the question is, and it's a bit of a philosophical one, is where do you draw a spatial boundary around domestic supply in terms of, do we define it as the whole of the country, or local domestic supply, or even domestic supply at the catchment level?
I can give you my opinion on that, which is that, our food system is a national food system. Well, actually, it's a global food system, but in terms of food security, we have a national food system. And so I think the question then becomes, how do you integrate matters of national value within a Te Mana o Te Wai framework? Is Te Mana o Te Wai only to be considered at the catchment scale, the scale of water, or does it recognise that the water supports values wider than that? And so that is our argument, is that you have to look to national values. And I think that if you think about the way that Levin and Pukukue have been recognised within the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water for their role locally in supporting national domestic food supply of fresh vegetables, and in particularly in winter. And so that gives you an indication that within the NPSFM it does contemplate that whilst we have to manage elevate the value of water first, and that is of course local to where the water is, those second and third hierarchy values may occur outside of that spatial scale, and that has to be integrated. I think that there are other examples of that within the MPSFM, you know, for example, the recognition of hydroelectricity elevated within the MPSFM, and of course that's a third hierarchy activity.
Okay, yeah, I'd probably be interested in comments from other witnesses as we move along on that, because it's sort of, I think if you use the national argument for domestic supply, it's sort of the river's on a bit of a hiding, individual river's on a bit of a hiding to nothing there, because the domestic supply at the national level is always going to be possibly or arguably greater than the needs at the sort of the catchment level, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but we don't grow all our food in our backyard, and nor can we. You know, there are many parts of New Zealand where people live that they cannot grow their own food, and that would be cities, for example. So, you know, I'm from Wellington, and Wellington grows almost none of the food that is consumed there, and it relies on other regions for that. And Hawke's Bay is, has a very favourable climate, has highly productive soils, and so plays an important role in terms of food production for New Zealand. And that is, it's not evenly distributed across catchments, and so we see those catchments like Pukekoi and Levin, which are very different to here and grow different crops and are really recognised in the MPSFM because they have poor water quality, but they were recognised in a transitional way within the MPSFM because it became apparent that to bring those catchments up to the bottom, even to the bottom lines, could risk the reliable supply of fresh vegetables in winter, until such time we have a way of recognising this question that you're asking: how do we do allocation in this country? And so because it was uncertain, they were recognised in the plan. In Hawke's Bay we don't have quite that situation. It's not that we're talking about a situation where vegetable growing or fruit growing would be elevated above bottom lines. We're not talking about that. Freshwater is still the first priority, but we are talking about making natural resource management decisions which recognise the value of food. And I think really what you start to think about is the relative importance of the municipal, or the drawing of water away from the plains where it supports food production towards the towns, and that is an area where we seek recognition here that whilst drinking water is a second priority and it's very important, so too is food production. So we wouldn't want to see water being diverted away from the plains where it has such an important role.
All right, thank you.
Just one question. There were a lot of comments from the farmers about 20 cubic metres a day being inadequate for stock water supplies, for instance, on hill country properties. Is Hort NZ satisfied that the 20 cubic metres a day for rootstock survival would be sufficient in all cases?
No, it's probably not sufficient in all cases, but and Ms Holmes can speak to this, but for it is used now in the existing situation. So in the existing situation, there's not the minimum flow is 2,400, and there isn't another way that people can use water for keeping their trees alive other than that permitted take, and so that is what is used now. So it's kind of about the status quo. It is, with rootstock survival water, only a very small amount of water is required, and so 20 cubic metres for many people would be sufficient. It kind of does depend on the scale of their operation.
The other associated thing is I think Pernod Ricard have asked for a specific policy that's in Plan Change 6 for the Tuki relating to rootstock survival. You might want to look at their submission. I can't remember whether it's submission 94 or page 194 of something, which specifically asks for that. And if Hort NZ would support that particular proposition.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just turn back again to this issue.
sorry,
Mana
Commissioners.
Tawai in the hierarchy.
Sorry, just to
Yeah.
jump in, I know that we're sort of on a bit of a time hiding here. I know that we have another sort of 5 experts, and while this is incredibly important, I just sort of point you to the fact we may be running out of time at the end, and I would hate to compromise other experts answering questions.
What we might do then, if you'll leave, we might hear experts and then have our questions all together. And then you can work out who's going to answer it, or do tag team on the
If the
question.
Commissioners are happy with that, that would work for us.
You're comfortable with that, right, Roger? We'll do that, thanks.
Thank you. In that case, next up, I'd like to invite Mr. Damien Farrelly.
Morning. So, in the interest of time, I'll try and get this through quickly. So my name is Damien Farrelly. I'm manager of the NZ GAP program, which is owned by Horticulture New Zealand. NZ GAP stands for New Zealand Good Agricultural Practice. So an assurance system for fruit and vegetables, and we developed an environment management system add-on, which delivers on the requirement for certified and audited farm environment plans. So one of the main aspects of these assurance programs is that they're integrated assurance. We try and deliver on multiple issues in one system. The other GAP program that's operational in New Zealand and a lot in Hawke's Bay is Global GAP, and growers are required to be GAP certified for market access for fresh and processed vegetables, fruit and vegetables. The EMS integrates with both NZ GAP and Global GAP, so a grower has their GAP program for market access, and then the EMS is that integration with the Farm Environment Plan requirements, which we have developed local guidelines for that are region and catchment specific. Looking at Schedule 30, support the recognition of industry programs in the Section 42A and the addendum. We are supportive of the recommendations, except for there are some additional requirements that we think could be incorporated to make it a little bit more straightforward and user-friendly. And those are around the content of farm environment plans versus the delivery of farm environment plans either via the council, catchment collective or industry programme. The other component for recognition of industry schemes, there's been additional requirements for reporting added in. We did request more clarity on the reporting expectations. It's my view that the current requirements are perhaps excessive. They will add significant administration and therefore compliance costs for growers. So my recommendation is those reporting requirements are more outcomes focused. In my evidence, I've supplied reporting expectations around data tiers, and while we recognise that recognition of industry programs is really important, we would like that assurance to be recognised, therefore reporting requirements to be I suppose more aligned with those assurance outcomes rather than the on-farm practices or inputs. The last point then there is just where the EMS is at, and we've got formal recognition in 2 regions at the moment, Environment Canterbury and Gisborne District Council, working on recognition in other regions where plan changes are currently happening. And when the Resource Management Act Section 9A regulations come out at the end of this month, we will be seeking recognition of the EMS for that as well. So the national system for delivery of audited and certified farm plans, freshwater farm plans. That is my summary.
Thank you, and we'll come back to you with questions.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Ms. Catherine Sturgeon.
Kia ora, I'm Catherine Sturgeon. I'm a water quality scientist. Firstly, I just want to start by outlining the recommendations that I support from the Section 42A addendum, such as the use of consistent terminology, such as target attribute states throughout the plan, removal of the TN concentration priority map, an update of the sediment yield priority map, and inclusion of hill slope erosion provisions in Schedule 30. The next points are a summary of my evidence, of which the focus is the provisions within PC9 that set the limits and actions for achieving the proposed water quality outcomes over time. The priority maps in the plan outline the timeframes for when subcatchments need to have freshwater farm plans completed. The effectiveness of freshwater farm plans in contributing to an improvement in water quality and meeting the water quality objectives of the plan relies on the priority maps to have been created correctly and cover the contaminants of concern in each subcatchment. There is an importance of a line of sight between the actions and priorities on the farm linking to water quality and water quality outcomes in the catchment. To that end, I still recommend the replacement of TP and TN yield maps with the DIN and DRP concentration maps to enable usability of the plan, so getting buy-in from those using the plan and creating these freshwater farm plans by showing the clear linkage to the outcome of the plan, and to capture high priority subcatchments that are missed using the modelling approach that is currently used. This is discussed further in the Water Quality Joint Witness Statement, which was provided on Friday. My next point is about policy Tank 21. So nitrogen loss is a focus of this policy, as outlined in the Section 42A report. The reason of this was because it is a contaminant of particular concern, with freshwater concentrations exceeding target attribute states in many places within the tank catchments. My evidence shows that sediment, phosphorus and E. coli are also key water quality contaminants within many of the subcatchments, and the attributes least likely to meet the target attribute states with the way the current plan is worded and the way the current priority maps have been created. Policy Tank 21 uses land use change as a limit in the plan. However, land use change is only assessed based on nitrogen losses and therefore conceivably allows an increase in other contaminants. For example, a land use change from commercial vegetable crop to a beef farm is more favourable than the other way around, but would result in an increase in E. coli losses from that farm. In my opinion, a multi-contaminant approach will result in better water quality outcomes overall. Therefore, I recommend that the wording to Policy Tank 21 be amended to enable land use change to be assessed based on a multi-contaminant approach. And the specific wording is outlined in my evidence. And that's it.
Thank you very much. We now turn to Ms. Gillian Holmes.
This is very efficient. You've been
Oh, no,
practicing.
I know.
Excellent. I like this panel of questions at the end. I think this will help.
I've lost the PowerPoint.
You've killed my PowerPoint.
It was efficient.
Yeah,
There we go.
No, you're going to...
Oh, and I'll take this opportunity to note actually that appendix to Ms. Sands' evidence are briefs of evidence from individual growers, and they'll be appearing afterwards. And I note that Mr. Scott Lawson has a space as well, and he is going to be following our presentation. Thank you.
So, good morning. So, yeah, my name's Gillian Holmes, and I was looking at the water quantity components of the plan, and really looking at how the ability of growers to be able to take and continue to use water reliably within the tank catchments. So the main points I'm just going to summarise now would be so transfers. So just support the use of transfers, and I do support the changes that have been recommended in the 42A report. I believe that sort of makes it clearer about what opportunities there are for transferring, and also support from an effects perspective. I do support the reallocation of water within the interim groundwater limit, and then moving on for the actual and reasonable definition. So I support the 42A amendment change, which is restating the word maximum into that definition rather than the average. And there were other minor changes that I did propose, which I still support because I do think they do improve the definition. So that was around the definition of accurate. It was including a reference to the augmentation volume as a possibility of assessing what that would be and putting that as a consent limit. and also looking at the use of around the 10 years, but it's really looking at the implementation of if growers have less than 10 years of actual data, using that in conjunction with, say, the calculations from EraCalc to form a better or a more accurate site-specific assessment of what the actual and reasonable water use would be. At the moment, as it reads, it's sort of one or the other, and there could be a combination. And finally, on the minimum flows and rootstock, so I support the minimum flows that have been proposed, but that is contingent on the rootstock saliva water, as has already been discussed, being included as a permitted activity rule. And I do support the changes that have been made in the addendum about specifying the 20 cubic metres per day as on existing use. That's the main points.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to Mr. Stuart Ford.
Good morning. My evidence is based on my economic skills and also my experience in nutrient modelling. So I've given you considerable evidence about the economic performance of the area under consideration and the importance for economic augmentation in the future. So water reliability is incredibly important for the horticultural operations, much more so than pastoral operations, because water reliability has a huge influence on the quality of production in horticultural systems. If quality falls off, the economic return falls off very quickly. And I've shown in my evidence where AgFirst did some work on different flow regimes, and they incorporated water quality into that work, and you can see that the EBIT drops off very quickly as water reliability drops off in the horticultural sector. And there's no way of overcoming that. Transfers, I've just stated that I'm generally in favour of free transfers as being the most economically efficient, but in this situation we've got a limited supply of land with the characteristics which are required to produce these crops. So I'm fully in favour of economic transfer within versatile land being a provision within this planning thing. I've given you extensive evidence into the economics around rootstock survival water provisions, and I think it's fully justified from an economic perspective, and matches the livestock water consideration. I've also given you extensive evidence on N-loss from horticulture, and that was mainly because the AgFirst reports which were used in development of the tank concentrated on individual crops. And it's very important, I think, to consider horticulture in terms of, particularly in vegetable production, for the whole rotation. And that's why our recommendation is that for horticulture, in terms of N-loss, that it's considered in terms of the whole rotation and over the average rotation. I think there's a danger that people pick out individual crops and highlight their N-loss potential when the N-loss potential for the total rotation is much less. And land use change, I prefer the original Schedule 29. I think the method of bringing in a proxy measure for land use change is very inefficient, and I think it's much more efficient to have an effects-based approach to land use change than the proxy approach, which is presently in Schedule 29. So that's a summary of my highlights of my evidence.
Thank you.
Okay,
Now, are we up to the last?
we're up to it.
We have up next Mr. Dooney.
We might do something a little bit different. We might ask our questions now and then hear from Mr. Dooney last. if
Oh, that's a good
okay.
idea. Would you like me to put all the experts up here in a panel?
That would be great if
myself,
they can
and then
fit.
you have them all in front of you. That's all of them.
Thank you. We'll see how many of my yellow tabs come off. What we can start from that end and go down to this end.
Systems like mine.
Perhaps I'll just, just gathering our thoughts, it's a general question. It seems to me that the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water, in terms of vegetable growing or food production, is looking at two particular areas, and one is the area that I'd identified earlier in terms of those horticultural areas which are identified in the appendix. But also there are other references to food production throughout the NPS, and the other side is Mahinga Kai, where there's customary food harvest. And it seems to be it's an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, subsistence economy, hunting and gathering, and on the other side, commercial growing. And I'm still just trying to get my head around the domestic part that sits there and the correlation between the domestic and the commercial and I've heard, I think, a robust argument about there's a national food system in New Zealand, but I'm trying to apply that to the Hawke's Bay and thinking about the diversity of the types of crops. And there's a large number of land, not large amount of land that's being used for wine growing, and I'm not sure that comes under the heading of food security and fitting that tier 2. It seems to be very squarely in tier 3. But
Neither do I. Yeah. So when we're talking about tier 2, we are just talking about the essential human health needs of the New Zealand population. And because of our geographic isolation, New Zealand does need to produce particularly fresh food here. We don't import many fresh vegetables, things like summer fruit, bit squishy. They don't, we have to grow them here to eat them. And so, no, we're not
I'm looking
talking
for a
about...
little bit more detail about the food security. Sounds like a nice little label to include a lot of things. I'm wanting to just unpack that a little bit.
So we're not talking about crops that are grown predominantly for export and whereby New Zealanders consume a part of them, but really as a kind of, it's grown anyway and we eat part of it. So that would be the case for apples, that would be the case for wine, that would be the case for kiwi fruit, that's the case for meat, and it's the case for milk. But it's not the case, it's actually the case for squash, it's the case for onions, but it's not the case for many fruits and vegetables that are grown in New Zealand actually for domestic food supply. And so we are making that distinction and recognising the importance of that value.
Thank you. That's helpful.
So I'll just go through these things in the order that they're in my yellow stickies here. So Dr. Farrelly, you first, please. Can I take you to your paragraphs 31 and 33? And we're talking about the New Zealand Good Agricultural Practice certification there when you talk about it in those paragraphs 31 and 32. So that's primarily related to food quality assurance, is that correct? Those paragraphs 31 and 30. Sorry, I'm talking.
Yep.
Oh, yes.
So when it comes to quality, most quality components are driven by the market. So that's about the grading of how good the produce is. NZGAP certification looks more for those intrinsic values around food safety, environment and social practice, things that can't be seen, and providing assurance that those outcomes are being achieved so that we have safe and sustainable produce.
And on the same page, paragraph 33, you talk about a grower group. So that could be someone like Mr. Apple or Turners and Growers as a single entity?
Essentially, yeah, the most widely known grower group would be Zespri. So we've one certification across hundreds of growers that are all operating the same system, and generally they're managed by the marketer, and they can have similar systems for if they have one crop. Generally, they have one or two crops as well, so they can have consistent systems to deliver safe and sustainable produce, but also can have the quality element added in for that market.
And I think you give examples of other councils where that sort of practice has been agreed, such as Environment Canterbury.
Yep. And what we've done with the grower groups, generally, as I've pointed out, have been a market-facing entities, and we're working through in Gisborne District Council at the moment is rather than market-driven, it's catchment-driven. So growers in a collective working together on farm environment plans or freshwater farm plans, rather than working together on assurance for market access.
And my final question is on your paragraph 89, where you talk about the policy recognition of industry programs. But I did note that industry programs isn't defined in the list of in the glossary to Plan Change 9. Would it help if that were defined? I'm not sure whether it's in scope of your submission.
We did note that there was inconsistency in definitions, but didn't specifically request a definition for industry programs. From the horticulture industry point of view, it's more about the criteria within an industry program is the thing that's nearly creating a definition in some ways. I think it would be helpful to have a definition, but for us, I'm not sure if it's absolutely necessary, because I think the criteria is more important.
So helpful but not essential, if you like.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just while we've got you there, I just had a question just around for the plan, land use, and this is something I've asked Beef and Lamb in terms of CapEx, whether they're wanting to make an intervention into their practice or make an investment that's going to help change the practice for forward outcomes. How does that work in terms of GAP?
So generally give growers a transition timeline, either regulatory driven or by the industry. Industry is setting their own expectations, but we work on a 5-year timeline as the general approach. And if the council deadline is sooner than that, in places like Canterbury, where growers must be at good management practice by, I think it was 2019, then they would have to make that investment in a more...
That was going to be, you've answered my second question. The
Yeah.
third question is going to be about where you might have a resource consent or a particular rule in the plan which requires a particular outcome to be achieved by a certain time. Does GAP have that ability to build that in?
Yeah, so we have had issues in some regions where the consenting conditions also fitting into the farm planning components, and keeping those not necessarily apart, but having clarity about the roles and responsibilities between consent officers, farm environment plan auditors, and planners is an area that we have other regions have struggled with as well. But generally, if there's a council deadline, we will incorporate that into the system.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just going back to the NZ GAP and the EMS add-on? Can you, probably in your evidence, but I was wondering if you could perhaps summarise it in terms of the auditing side of that. How does that work in the real-world situation? I think we've used ECAN as an example. How does that auditing of the EMS, how does that feed back to the regional council? So that's undertaken by NZ GAP auditors? Is that
so NZ GAP is a scheme owner. We set the standards and benchmark to requirements like Hawke's Bay Regional Council and Plan Change 9. We contract out the auditing to third parties. Assure Quality and SGS are the two approved auditing bodies for NZ-GAP. And how the audit itself works, in as little detail as possible, as the grower does a self-assessment and ensures that they've got everything in place to meet the requirements. They can do that themselves or with help of an advisor. And the auditor will review documentation, interview the grower, and also do a field walk to inspect any of the mitigations. So we call that triangulated assurance, where they're looking at records and the interview and inspection of the mitigations. And an audit report then is submitted to NZ-GAP, and based on the outcomes, if grower is fully compliant, they can be issued a certificate. If they've got corrective actions they need to make, they have a time frame. Generally it's 28 days, but in year one they can have up to 3 months to get those corrective actions completed. And then to maintain certification, they're re-audited on a frequency based on their performance. So compliant growers are in random audits up to every 3 years they can be audited, or they can be annual audits, which include targeted audits on top of that. Your last point about reporting through to council, we do a summary report that goes through to council, and that's similar to what we do for Food Act. Through to MPI, a summary audit report goes through. So when we benchmark the requirements of the farm plan, we also do benchmarking of the reporting outcomes. And this is the one area that causes probably most issues in regions where rather than an assurance outcome, this grower is compliant, here's their property boundary and some basic criteria. Some of the reporting is getting towards all the mitigations and all of the practices on farm, which is in the addendum here, and that's a very detailed approach. It's essentially the full farm plan rather than the outcome of the audit, which is where we would like to get to.
So the development of the actual plan, is that who undertakes that?
So it's not required to be done. We have a flexible approach, I suppose. If a grower has competency in-house or themselves, they have to demonstrate that they have that competency to develop their farm plan. But we also have the ability for them to use advisors. And then in the regions where it's a requirement that the grower uses a council-approved advisor, then we would adopt that requirement. So there's options basically based depending on the grower's competency and the availability of advisors and the council's drivers for advisors as well.
And who ensures that the plan is the contents of the plan are consistent with, say, Schedule 30 of the...
So that's done by NZ-GAP in the scheme. So we've built the system so that when a grower interacts with it, they're interacting with a farm plan that has been recognised by the council as having all the requirements in there and benchmarked to the farm plan requirements in Schedule 30.
Thank you.
And the way we do that is with the regional guide, just to highlight the areas that are council specific, because there's a lot of commonality between regions, but then if there's a specific in council, we'll say it's something that needs to be mapped. Conservation areas, well then that will be highlighted so that both growers and auditors know that that's something that's very specific to the tank catchment.
Thanks. I just had some questions for Ms. Sturgeon. The first of those is I just want to be reminded again, what's the driver from your perspective, or drivers from your perspective, for the focus or the addition of DIN, DRP and E. coli?
So you mean replacing the
Yes.
TN and TP yield maps with DIN and DRP maps and the addition of E. coli maps. So the main driver for that is basically to have a multi-contaminant approach and to enable usability of the plan. So in order to achieve the water quality outcomes, you need the priority maps to prioritise what catchments need improving in those specific contaminants that are outlined in Schedule 26. And so it's just having that link between your subcatchment being a high priority because it's in the D band for this in Schedule 26. That's really the driver by having multiple maps.
Do you see any particular implications for horticultural users, the horticultural sector? So those three contaminants?
Any implications? Can you repeat the question?
It's a bit of a general question. It just seemed to me that I was trying to get my head around. I've said in your evidence that it would fit well with the NPSFM Schedule 26, but I was wondering if there were any other drivers from the science perspective of why you'd want to have those particular three contaminants included as well, and whether there was any implications of that on the horticultural sector or not.
Well, I think, for horticulture, E. coli is not such a problem.
That's right.
But generally...
I'm not trying to put words in your
No,
mouth. You're going in the right direction.
Generally, it's more about having that clear line of sight between what you're trying to achieve and the tools that you're going to use to achieve it. The focus on nitrogen is not necessarily going to lead to the outcomes that are in Schedule 26.
Okay.
Can I just add one thing to that, just a point of clarity perhaps? So I don't think the proposal that Ms Sturgeon has made actually makes much difference in terms of those areas that are captured as priority from a horticulture perspective, because horticulture's in the lowlands, in one way or another it will be high priority and they will be progressing with farm plans. So it's not, there perhaps are some subcatchments outside of the horticulture area which would be captured, but really it was more about, from my perspective, you know, when you're trying to persuade growers to undertake a farm plan and to undertake some action, that they understand what they're doing and how it links to the water, because it can be very frustrating, I suppose, if they go, oh, but hang on a minute, the stream down the road is okay for that one and has got more of a problem for this other one. So it's more about, from my perspective, behaviour change. That doesn't really, everyone will still have to be doing a farm plan.
Yeah, and there are some subcatchments where they're high priority on the maps currently, and you turn to Schedule 26 that have the water quality targets, and they're below targets already, and it can be that's the TN yield maps, and then you might look at DIN and it's below the target, so it can just if you're going to do a freshwater farm plan, it would be surprising to see that actually the catchment was already meeting the target when it was a priority to create that. And there's also some other problems with the TN and TB yield maps, just that there's some hill country catchments that seem to be missed using the modelling approach.
I've got this is at your paragraph 110, and it's talking about so that the current provisions may be inflexible to a situation where negligible increases in DIN may be appropriate. An example is where an activity increases in DIN may result in improvement in water quality. And I was just wondering if you could give a real example of that, what that might be. But
Sorry, which?
This is paragraph 110. I hope I've got the right. I hope this is yours. I'm pretty sure it is. Which one? Oh no. There you go. It's the right question, but to the wrong person. Yeah. Mr. Dooney.
Oh.
And we're coming back to you, so just go. Oh. But I thought it might have been related to your particular evidence.
Might have been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what I've done. I've picked that up in his, but I was looking for an example of that. So this is Mr. Dooney's evidence, 110, and it's with the submission is supporting council's intention in seeking to avoid effects of nitrogen loss from land use change, and relating to negligible increases in DIN may be appropriate, and it says an example is where an activity increases in DIN may result in improvement of water quality. And I was wondering if you could give me an example of where that actually occurs.
I suppose I did talk a little bit about that when I through my summary. So I did make an example of a land use change from commercial vegetable crop to a beef farm. You would reduce, you would increase E. coli losses.
Oh, so just like a land use change?
Yeah. So that's, okay. I think that's
rather than
From my
necessarily a
evidence.
change in practice or different types of crops and those types of things.
Yeah, so I'm talking about
Okay.
policy tank 21. was in my
Thank you.
Another example of that just might be, you know, in the context of He Waka and climate change, you know, farmers are seeking opportunities to reduce their emissions, and so there may be farmers who are seeking to, say, bring more vegetables into their rotations, and not necessarily for domestic food supply. These could be vegetables for export, but in that context, you might see a reduction in E. coli. Potentially, you could see a reduction in sediment if you were moving, depending on how the mitigations were placed, but you might see an increase in nitrate. So it's that sort of example as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, we better go to the right-hand side of the table for a change.
Yeah, Mr. Ford, I've got a couple of questions for you. And one of them stems from your initial evidence in paragraph 54, where you make the point there that the Hort NZ proposition is about plan change 9, providing sufficient water is made available to keep the plants alive. I'm not quite sure what that means.
Okay, it's separating the water use from productive use, which say for apples is for pit fruit is producing apples. There's a huge amount of, or high proportion of the water that's used goes into producing the apples. Yeah. We're not asking for or not advocating for water to continue to be used to produce apples. We just want sufficient water to keep the root stock alive.
Okay.
So there's the difference between production and keeping the root stock alive.
And a large part of your evidence is around the rootstock survival.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you make the point about with stock, you can move drinking water to them, or you can move stock to drinking water, but with plants, you can't.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And are you saying then that because of that, because neither of those options is open to plants, there is only one option for them, for the plants?
That's correct. Yes, they either get sufficient water to keep the rootstock alive, or the rootstock die.
All right.
And then there's a huge cost to re-establish them and get them up to production again.
Okay. And the other question I had was one that Ms. Sands raised, but also legal counsel, this is around Te Mana o Te Wai. And that is the time frame or the rate at which Te Mana o Te Wai can be implemented. Now, the cynic might say that's a easy way to get out of actually doing anything. By simply saying, you know, there needs to be further things done to ensure that it is implemented. You're not the only one saying this. I mean, other people are saying the same thing. Others are saying there's got to be more plan changes before we can really see Te Mana o Te Wai taking a grip. Now, I wonder whether you could just expand on that a little bit to make people like me more comfortable that it's not just a kind of fob off, you know, that there are real things out there that are holding up, really pushing Te Mana o Te Wai.
I can start, and then some of my technical people might be able to help. But I think that, or the way that I see it, is that to achieve the freshwater outcomes that reflect the community values, you know, there is a gap between our current state and that, you know, and that outcome, on that vision and those values being fully met. What we're doing with this plan is looking at how we will manage natural resources in the next 10 years to move us towards that position.
I understand that.
And to there are some things that need to be done, I think, in this 10 years in order for us to move to the next step. So one of those things would be around, the paper allocation with water. So at the moment it's over-allocated in paper. We don't fully know the extent of that. So one of the really important things that this plan will achieve is to move everybody to the actual and reasonable. We'll have a much better understanding of the water that is needed to sustain the existing activity. And at the same time, we can start to look at opportunities for storage and augmentation, which, if they can come into place during this period of time, we'll be able to understand whether or not some of that water that's taken from the groundwater could switch in the next plan, or whether or not it can't. And then since we'll know, that water is really being used for actual and reasonable use to support the activities, we would understand in the future plans, say further clawback was being sought, what the actual economic, social and cultural consequences of that are. So I think that it is really important that we take a staged approach, but that staged approach has a clear line of sight towards our ultimate goal, which is Te Mana o Te Wai, and which is achieving freshwater values. But my position is that the horticulture sector understands that, and we understand that our community wants outcomes that are better than they are now, but we also, our growers want to remain growing here. They also recognise the value of this place for horticulture. So it's about understanding what can be done to get to that place. And so I think it is a staged approach. But I think that we absolutely need to design provisions which achieve real improvement over this period of time. And so I suppose that would be some of the things that Ms. Sturgeon has described, really making a clear line of sight between the action we take and the outcomes that are sought.
Yeah. The hierarchy is quite clear. It starts with fresh water at the top and works its way down. And I think both of you make the point that all three need to be sort of implemented pretty much at the same. One doesn't go without the other two, in other words. And I just wonder whether or not that's one of the things that's sort of making it, stymie is probably not the right word, but I persistently hear people say that, Te Mana o Te Wai has still got a long way to go yet before it gets implemented. It's not just you, but the refrain that I'm hearing keeps saying the same thing. And I'm wondering whether perhaps this might not be a real good opportunity for somebody to be making a bolder statement, I suppose, or really stepping forward, because no one is. They aren't. It just keeps saying the same thing. And I partly expected that out of this plan change. That's one of the things I read into it initially. But I'm not yet hearing it being sort of echoed, not just here, but throughout the whole hearing. I really appreciate the extent to which you've addressed the issue. The legal counsel, for example, is really, I followed what you were saying, and it was great. But I get to a point, I said, we hit it's not a brick wall, but you come to a stop. And then I'm wondering what the next thing is. And you made the point about horticultural growers understanding what that is, and I wasn't quite sure whether it was a question or you're telling me that's what they...
I'll ask you, Commissioner, was there a question at the end of that?
Yeah. And were you saying that was a question you were putting to horticulturalists?
No. I think, what I hear from growers is that, and many of them, and you'll hear from some growers with us today, have been involved in the tank process for many years, and they have heard from the community and iwi and hapu that there is a vision and value for values for these catchments that are not currently being met, and there is a challenge. And I think that they are, wanting to meet that, understanding that things will need to change. And I suppose what we are talking about is a staged approach so they can adapt and they can innovate within this period of time to use their water more efficiently, to seek different sources of water that have lesser effects, to perhaps change their crop rotation so they have lesser effects, to, you know, so they need some time, but with a clear vision of what is being achieved. And I suppose, to your point you made earlier about whether or not this plan does give effect to mana o te wai, and I suppose, and you know, our position is not fully, but it is on the way to doing that. And I think that there is a change in mindset here, you know, from perhaps how we looked at more of a, sometimes in previous plans where we looked to sort of balance social and economic outcomes against, you know, environmental ones. I don't think that's what we're doing here. We're saying that water is first, and everything that we are doing is to try and adapt so we can achieve the second and third hierarchy activities within that framework over time. And I suppose, but I guess it depends on your perception. You know, rootstock survival water is an example which I say in my evidence, I think that the way it does require some water to be taken when the rivers are in low flow. And our argument is that that is still putting the river first, because at this time we are not taking, or the growers are not taking as much as they need or as much as they want, but just the bare minimum so they can continue, you know, to have trees in the good times as well as the bad. And so
keeping the plants alive.
That's right. So that, we think, is an example of te mana o te wai, but, you know, some other people might not agree.
Thank you.
Just in commissioners, in the interests of being able to hear from those growers, I note that we have 10 minutes left on our bill, and we are sort of hear from the panel.
Yes. We've just got a few more questions, and then we're going to get Mr. Dooney, and then we might bite a little bit into our morning tea time. We're happy to do that.
So I've just got 3 questions. The first one's for Ms. Sturgeon. In her appendix report, Dr. Heidegger's included new proposed maps for phosphorus and nitrogen. And I was just unclear from the joint witness statement whether you supported those new appendices or not.
No, I don't.
You don't?
I don't. I support the inclusion of a...
Sorry, can you speak up a wee bit?
I support the inclusion of a dissolved inorganic nitrogen concentration map and a dissolved reactive phosphorus concentration map. Okay,
so it should be DIN and DRP in your view. Thank you. And I have 2 questions for Mr. Ford. And the first one is, sorry, I'm jumping from 10 things to another here. We've got three difficulties. Can I simply, your paragraph 60 and the paragraphs that follow, all that's based on the report that was written for Tasman District Council, is that
yes,
correct?
That's correct, yes.
Secondly was the definition of, or the comment about, if I can take you to your 94, what is a full crop rotation? How would that be? I'm very unclear as to how that would be defined.
I think there is a definition.
Yes,
suggested by Mr. Ducey. It's basically, as I explained, from year to year, crops that are grown by vegetable production, you know, wax and wane. So I think it's described as an average crop rotation.
Which is very hard for growers that might rotate potatoes, onions, squash, leafy greens, etc.
No, it's not. It's just picking what would be an average mix of those crops.
Over a several year period.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
My final question relates to the proposed definition of a nitrogen budget, because I'm jumping around from 10 different things here, but if I look at the appendix provided by Council, insert definition for, I assume it's a nitrogen budget or a nutrient budget, I'm not sure, means a calculation that compares plant nutrient demand and supply to assist with appropriate nutrient concentrations and nutrient management. The budget can be crop crop specific or at a property scale. I don't know what that means in terms of a legal definition in a plan. If I was interpreting the plan, I'd look at a definition like that and say, I don't understand it. Can you be more specific?
Yeah, it's a definition of a nutrient budget, not a nitrogen budget. So where is it? Were you referring to in my evidence? Sorry.
It's on the second back of the last page of your council's evidence.
I am.
Or your council submissions, I should say.
Oh, okay, so it's a nitrogen budget. I think that's just a general definition of a nutrient budget as such. And I think it's talking about supply and demand, if you want to put it in economic terms, and so it's how much is applied versus how much is taken out by the crop.
Okay. And my only other comment is that Schedule 29 is very unpopular with everybody. Be it the new version, the old version, any version, it's been very much commented on.
It's been quite consistent.
That's good, because Ms Sands asked me what I thought of the second attempt at it, and I said, well, I by far approve of the first.
Nobody likes either version.
There you go.
Well, that's correct as well, if you've got a choice.
I think we're going to hear from Mr. Dooney, and unless we had some more questions. Let's see how we go.
Just purely for the interest of time, very simply, I was going to summarise to say that I support the general approach of Plan Change 9, but it could be improved by clarifying several issues. And those bullet points there have been addressed really as you've gone through the experts so far, I think, so I don't probably need to reiterate them. I would like to talk about some of the addendum changes that were made very briefly, and they've been talked about also, but just some important issues to reiterate: the clarification for rootstock survival water. It's a very important point, and that was clarified in the addendum. And I also wanted to talk about, acknowledge the changes made in the addendum report to tank 5 and 6 to include other contaminants, but I also support the opinion of Ms Sturgeon for Policy 21 to retain flexibility with all contaminants to be covered. And I note that the inclusion of the definition of farm, which I support, and the changes to include an average for N-loss under the crop rotation and N-loss assessment, and the definition of crop rotation, which was just talked about before. Really just at that point, would happy to take any questions.
Just one, your paragraph 111 about policy 21. Were you involved in the Waipawa plan change one? Can't recall.
I'm involved now, but I wasn't at the time. I'm involved with appeal on behalf of Hort NZ.
I think what Hort NZ is seeking there in terms of amendment to that policy is similar to what was advanced in the Waikato Plan Change 1, and that it's sort of a bit of an unders and overs game. It's okay to possibly have a slight increase in N-loss in a catchment if that means there could be some reductions in other contaminants.
Yes.
In a nutshell, what that's saying?
Yes, although noting this plan doesn't have nitrogen allocation to consider, so it is slightly different.
Okay.
But it would be assessing the sub-catchment to see what the water quality issues are first within that sub-catchment.
Within the sub-catchment?
Yes.
Okay. And those sub-catchments are defined?
No, they're not defined, not in PC, no.
So a sub-catchment could mean
It is something that we did ask for in
Yes.
my evidence, yeah, it's not defined. I think the reference to sub-catchments was recommended to be removed. But I do find that confusing.
Oh, no, further questions for the witness?
Well, Dr. Cow is just finding his questions there. This is at 122 of your evidence. It's just regards you support the sinking lid approach. And I was just wondering, you could give me your view of what you think the advantages and disadvantages of the sinking lid approach are.
I think clearly the advantages are with the sinking lid approach with actual and reasonable is to, as Ms Sands talked about already today, is to get an idea of what actual usage is over the period of the plan. I think that is an important part of it. I think the disadvantages could be, and it's probably dealt with in other parts of my evidence where I look for more flexibility, where there could be issues with unforeseen use of water that the plan restricts at this point. But overall, as I said in my evidence, I support that as a cornerstone and as a way of achieving the objectives of the plan.
I had a question about the stream depletion calculator, but I can't work out what it is. I know it's been taken out of the definitions in the addendum report and in the original section 42A. Did Port NZ seek its replacement or retention? I'm just not clear because I've got some notes about it, but I can't follow my own notes.
I can't answer that question.
No,
but
we didn't, we were just happy with the inclusion of it, yes.
So I can't follow your paragraph 147 and where that would come into where you're advocating that comes in, please. So you've got it under the definition of actual and reasonable.
yes.
This is on your page 57 of your...
Sorry, were you paragraph 147? Did you say?
Yeah, your paragraph 147.
Yes.
And then it comes in on your page 57 of your report in the changes sought.
Yes, one
so
second.
it's D for takes with an associated minimum flow.
This relates to Ms Holmes' evidence.
Yeah, the augmentation.
Yes, so if she could talk to that.
Yes, so, sorry, what was the question? So how it fits in with it?
Does that come into the is that still sought in the definition of actual and reasonable?
It's one of the things that I said that it is a minor change, but I do sort of support that it's something that needs to be considered when looking at the actual and reasonable use of a consent. If you're putting in for a new consent, if you looked at how much you might need for the augmentation, had that sitting on your consent so it's clear what you will be using during the augmentation time. So it's not like a separate process, it's clear to everyone where that sits.
Okay, thank you.
questions have already been answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're at 10:42. Time.
So we do have the growers.
On my list, I've got them at 11 o'clock.
We have a few appendix to Ms Sands' evidence, and we have, I believe, Mr Scott Lawson at 11, but we also have Mr Gareth Holder and Mr Richard Pentreath here to address the panel on sort of the more practical implications. And I'm aware that Mr Scott Lawson has 20 minutes, and my understanding is that he's happy for overflow there. Is that your understanding, Ms Sands?
I don't have any questions for them.
There he is. Just confirming that he's happy with that overflow. He is. So I know that you had a break scheduled. Would you like to hear from one grower before the break and then hear from the remaining in Mr Scott Lawson's slot?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Looks like we're comfortable. Yep.
Excellent. Who would like to go first? I have Gareth or Richard. There we go. So just for reference, if we turn to Ms Sands' evidence, in her Appendix A, right at the end, we have Mr Richard Pentreath, President of Hawke's Bay Fruit Growers Association.
Kia ora koutou.
Welcome.
Yeah, I'm here as President of Hawke's Bay Fruit Growers Association and also as a grower myself. The Fruit Growers Association support the Horticulture New Zealand submission. Our primary purpose is to enable and support fruit growing in Hawke's Bay. We've got over 200 paying members. And a long history of supporting our members in Hawke's Bay of over 100 years. I'd like to say there's been significant advances in irrigation technology and efficient water use across our sector, and there's a real opportunity for us to continue to improve and become more efficient. The association acknowledged the needs of all other water users and wish to work in harmony with tangata whenua and all other users. A couple of things that are particularly pertinent or important to fruit growers are the ability to change land use. It's not a new thing. For generations, for centuries, farmers of all type have needed the ability to change their crops in response to market and environmental cues. And that's part of being sustainable, both environmentally and economically. Secondly, just like to support the request that the mechanism used to determine water take for fruit growing is based not only on historic use, but in some cases calculated use via the IRICalc tool. There's a real risk that too narrow a view, or basically the tool needs to take into account what the needs might be over an extended period and not just a narrow view. Thank you. That's all I wish to say.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Now, if you're happy to break, we'll hear from Mr Gareth Holder and Mr Scott Lawson after 11.
Right. Let's come back. We're only a few minutes over. We'll come back at 11:05.
11:05. Thank you very much.